and officially begin the webinar. Hello, I'm Jenna Lopez, Research and Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, welcome to today's webinar entitled Building a Protective Community for All Children and Adolescents, Best Practices in Sexual Violence Prevention and Intervention. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewack, and Chinookan nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with a responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As the Learning Network is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end the spectrum of gender-based violence, we also recognize that today these nations face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms that shape the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities. We commit to furthering our work in ways that best uphold solidarity with Indigenous survivors and those supporting them. We are happy to be joined today by Jessica Martin. Jessica Martin is a registered social worker in Quebec with a bachelor's degree in psychology, a certificate in youth intervention, and a graduate diploma in art therapy. Since 2020, she's been a project manager and trainer for Marie-Vincent's prevention and training team, contributing to the development and implementation of programs like L'Enterre for children ages 0 to 5, and Boussole for children ages 6 to 12. Previously, she spent 11 years as a human relations officer and trainer at the Department of Youth Protection, specializing in child protection and intervention in cases of child abuse. At Marie-Vincent, she focuses on equipping caregivers, educators, and professionals to prevent the risk of sexual violence and respond effectively, helping to build a protective community for all children and adolescents. Please see her full bio on the Learning Network website. I will now pass it over to Jessica Martin to start the webinar.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thanks, Jenna, for introducing me, and thank you to the team of the Knowledge Hub and Learning Network so that I can give you this presentation today called Building a Protective Community for All Children and Adolescents. As part of this presentation, we're going to talk about best practices for sexual abuse prevention and intervention. So, as Jenna mentioned, I work at Marie-Vincent. It's a center that supports youth and children, and it's recognized by the Department of Justice of Canada. Our mission, what we want to do, is build a protective community for a world without sexual abuse for all children and for all teenagers. In order to do so, we work in several areas. We work on strengthening the capacities of community members to prevent sexual abuse, thanks to our various prevention programs, but we also offer training to professionals who work with children. Our services are supported by a dedicated helpline operated by our psychosocial workers from Marie-Vincent to support professionals who have questions about sexual abuse, for instance, and also problematic sexual behaviors that are of concern. This line is available to all professionals who work with children. In addition, we want to change the developmental pathways of children who are victims of sexual abuse or who have problematic sexual behaviors by offering them psychotherapeutic services, psychosocial services, and by supporting their loved ones. And we receive support from the Marie-Vincent Inter-University Research Chair that supports the team in updating scientific knowledge and evaluating services offered. Both psychotherapeutic services and prevention services that are developed at Marie-Vincent. Our learning objectives are to make you aware and understand concepts regarding sexual abuse. We want to better understand the problem of child sexual abuse and teenagers and the importance of prevention through sexuality education and promoting healthy, equal relationships. We're also going to look at the various consequences of childhood sexual abuse. We'll take a few minutes also to look at the specialized intervention model developed by Marie-Vincent and that we use. And finally, we'll look at the end of the presentation, we'll look on secondary victimization and the impact that this has in the life of the victimized child and the child's loved ones, and how we can prevent this secondary victimization. It's quite an ambitious plan, and I really hope we'll be able to get through all of it. So here is the outline of the presentation. So first of all, we'll look at the issue of sexual abuse against children and adolescents. We'll look at best practices and the foundations of the specialized sexual abuse intervention program and how, as professionals, we can empower the child and give them back their agency. When you talk about sexual abuse, first of all, we all have to agree on a common definition of what sexual abuse means, because this definition varies according to the country and even the historical time. It's only in 1983 that Sexual Offenses Act recognized that sexual attacks would take place within marriage. So we use the government of Quebec's definition, which is the definition used today. It's been in place for a number of years. It's an act of a sexual nature with or without physical contact committed by an individual without the consent of the person involved, or in some cases, particularly with children, through emotional manipulation and blackmail. So the first thing to remember is with or without physical contact, because when you think of sexual assault or abuse, often we think of assault with contact. But there are many types of sexual abuse, like cyber abuse, and there is absolutely no physical contact involved. But this influences how we work on prevention, in particular with young children. Often we say, be careful if somebody tries to touch you, come and tell me right away. But this is not the only type of violence that exists, and sexual abuse can exist in many forms and not necessarily physical. The second point is through emotional manipulation or blackmail. Legally, the age of consent in Canada is 16. Between 12 and 16 years of age, there are certain exceptions which enable consent depending on the age of the child. But below 12, consent does not exist. In our definition, When we talk about emotional manipulation or blackmail, it means that there are strategies being used by the perpetrator to simulate consentment and make the child believe that they are actually participating, whereas in fact it's manipulation and blackmail. Now, the second part of the definition tells us that this is an action that this is an act intended to impose one's will on another person for personal gratification through abuse of power and the use of force or coercion or explicit threats. Things like if things will go badly if you talk, you're going to hurt me, etc. But implicit threats are direct threats, like, for instance, threatening to harm the child if the child doesn't participate, or threaten the child with a weapon. Different types of threats, therefore. And often with children, but often with children, it's more implicit. This action violates fundamental rights, including physical and psychological integrity and personal security. We use this definition because it's an umbrella term. It applies to different contexts and different situations, no matter what the age, gender, culture, religion, sexual orientation of the victimized person or of the perpetrator. And it doesn't matter what the link is between these people, what kind of sexual act is committed. This definition applies to all situations. So now let's talk about the extent of the issue of sexual abuse. We may believe that sexual abuse only happens in certain environments, but in fact, sexual abuse can affect all children in all families, in all cultures. But there are certain environmental factors, systemic factors that are factors that play into sexual abuse, where there are marginalized communities, where there's a lack of daycare, there is a lack of youth services, a lack of, and where there's social isolation. Now, girls, working children, youth from sexually diverse and gender diverse backgrounds, children who are in foster care, and children with disabilities or those facing marginalization. These are the children who will be more at risk of suffering from sexual abuse. When we look at various studies, there's an average in Quebec of about 1 girl out of 5 and 1 boy out of 10 who's a victim before the age of 18. Unfortunately, this percentage is underestimated. We believe that this percentage only represents about 10% of what's actually going on. And when you look at the slide, this is exactly what we see. We see all the sexual abuse situations that were reported to the authorities, but there are also those that weren't disclosed, that people wanted to hide, or those that were experienced by children who didn't have the words to disclose and be heard. We don't see this. That's underwater. So if we look at the ages of the victims that we see in offenses in Quebec, in 2019, 62% of all sexual offenses reported to police were for minors. This is 5,636 reported incidents. And when you look at the prevalence in terms of gender, 77% of victims were female. Now, we hear very little about sexual abuse towards children and teens. It's a taboo topic, and it's minimized. It's severely minimized. Often we minimize the severity of what happens. But at Marie-Vincent, we look at the profiles of the children who come to us. And between 2006 and 2021, we got data from 463 children aged 6 to 12. And in terms of severity, what we see is that there was penetration or an attempted penetration among 63.8% of the children, touching underclothing 29.4%, and touching overclothing 6.8%. So you can see that the actions and the nature of these actions is quite severe. There are certain offenses that have evolved over the years. In Canada, certain police-reported sexual offenses have seen a significant increase in recent years. For instance, juvenile child pornography, child luring online, and the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. These crimes are rising significantly. If you look at child pornography, there's access, there's possession, production, and distribution of this child pornography. Between 2016 and 2020, there was a 75% increase in this kind of crime. In terms of online child luring between 2016 and 2016, there's a 57% increase. 57% increase. And as you know, it's very recent that the Canadian Criminal Code talks about sharing images as being a sexual crime. So our statistics are quite recent in Canada when it comes to this. Now, if we look at the disclosure of sexual assault, according to studies, one sexual assault out of 20 is disclosed. So that's 5 to 6% of the assaults that actually take place and are reported to the police every year. Once again, our police data is not at all representative of reality. We know this. If we go back to prevalence statistics that I gave about 1 girl out of 5 and 1 boy out of 10, you can see a difference in terms of gender. But statistically, and that's what we should be seeing. But it's very hard for boys to disclose. Sexual abuse by boys is underreported because the symptoms are less clear. It's rather their behavior that changes. And because boys are still socialized today to not show their emotions. So disclosing and disclosure is also associated with being weak, a victim. It's linked to weakness, and it's very hard, therefore, for boys to disclose. There are a lot of prejudices related to, or biases related to homosexuality, and that stops children from disclosing. And they're also afraid of being labeled as future perpetrators. So, for instance, a recent Quebec study on sexual abuse disclosure sheds some light on the fact that there's much less disclosure amongst men than women. But in this study, we saw that 16% of women had never disclosed their abuse before participating in the study. And when you looked at men, it went up to 30%. So you can see that there's a large difference in terms of disclosure between men and women. Sexual assault, sexual assault does not come alone. There's more than one type of maltreatment, and often this mistreatment, these different types of mistreatment or victimization, happen at the same time. According to a Quebec study from 2006, but which is very troubling. 19% of the individuals reported they'd experienced sexual abuse during childhood, but they were also victims of physical violence, and 14% experienced psychological violence. What we see in the Child Protection Department is that children experience um, uh, concomitant victimization. In 2012, 54% of children followed by child protection said that they experienced different kinds of violence. And what we know is that sexual assault is often seen by the child as the least hurtful, because at least they get some they feel that they're getting positive attention. For instance, a child who's neglected, who is left alone most of the time, who has parents who take drugs, who aren't there very often, kids who have to make their own food, who don't go to school because nobody cares about what's happening at school. They're isolated, they're neglected, and sometimes they see intimate partner violence. And if there's an uncle they see once a month, the uncle comes to the house and takes the child out to his or her favorite restaurant, takes them to the movies, buys them popcorn, but with, but at the same time, the child undergoes sexual abuse. And in this kind of situation, the sexual abuse is the best thing of all these bad things that happen, because at least the child gets some affection. And this also interferes with disclosure. In child protection services, we have to identify other types of violence or mistreatment before being able to detect sexual abuse and have the child disclose it. Unfortunately, when you look at the studies that show the impact of adverse experiences during childhood, the impact is even higher when the types of violence, when the child experiences multiple types of violence. And there are short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects, both for the children and their family, and even in society, because, for instance, you get intergenerational transfer of trauma. Now, let's look at the potential consequences associated with childhood sexual abuse. To start, it's important to explain that there's no single profile of a child who's being sexually abused. And all the each child has different experiences, different consequences. There are children who don't seem to have many or any consequences due to the sexual abuse they suffered. But for other children, there are severe consequences that have impacts on various parts of their lives. So there are no consequences that we can say will occur. It all depends on the child you're working with, on the situation, on the type of violence, and often a child who there are certain elements that constitute a protection against these consequences, or that will increase the risk of serious consequences. And when you talk about consequences, you also have to talk about resilience. What happens? The absence of symptoms amongst certain children can be related to resiliency. Resilience. It's the ability to bounce back, to get over certain traumatic events, the ability for an individual to deal with a difficult situation which causes stress or adversity, severe adversity. We know Boris Cyrulnik said that resilience is the art of navigating through turbulent waters. And this is very clear with adolescents and children who are sexually abused. There was a literature review in 2015 that reported that amongst children and adolescents, the between 10 and 53% of children were considered resilient. However, when you look at the various studies, you can see that resilience is not always defined in the same way. Is it just in one area or in multiple areas? And often with resilience, our sampling is only we only have females in our sampling. So you have to take this a little bit with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, there's there's quite a gap between 10 and 53% in terms of resilience. In most studies, resilience is defined as the absence of clinically significant psychological difficulties and adaptation challenges. It's the clinical level that we're talking about here when we're defining resilience. So about a third of children and teens who are victims of sexual abuse are asymptomatic. Now, how can we explain this absence of symptoms among sexual abuse victims? The use of effective coping strategies and numerous internal and external resources. But there are other reasons too that could explain the absence of symptoms. For instance, avoidance of sexual abuse, which masks the presence of difficulties. And this is a short-term strategy that works. But in the long term, what happens is there's more distress, more unhappiness amongst these children. There's also a latent effect, a deterioration occurring in 10 to 20% of youth whose symptoms arrive later, or sometimes when we work with children in therapy, at the beginning, we don't know exactly how distressed they are. But if you see them a year later, you see that there are various issues that we can work on. So there's another element that's important, and that's the sensitivity of research measurement instruments to measure the level of distress these children feel. And that's something that perhaps should be worked on further. Now, when you look at the consequences of sexual abuse on children, the impact on children, you have to take a holistic approach to see the person as a whole and measure impacts in various areas of their life. According to the literature, there are various potential consequences that can occur. I'm not going to go into detail because the profiles can be very complicated, but it's important to see to what extent various areas of life may be affected, both in the life of the child and their loved one. Spiritually speaking, for instance, everything related to the meaning given to the event of sexual abuse, everything that affects their beliefs. Children say, for instance, if that happens to me, it's because I'm a bad person. Or a child growing up in a community that places high value on virginity. In that case, the child may think that she's been sullied and she has less value because of the sexual assault. If you look at behavior, you can see children who have behavioral problems, for instance, problematic sexual behaviors can occur after sexual abuse. There might be self-harm or substance abuse, drugs, alcohol, and these are ways to avoid the situation. Teenage pregnancy, also In terms of problems that are social or in terms of relations, that there are often children who feel very isolated because they feel that they're the only ones who have experienced this kind of event, and there's no one who understands them. In terms of love relationships, there's trouble trusting people or feeling that they will be re-victimized. There's intimate partner violence. Uh, in terms of symptoms, cognitive symptoms and emotional symptoms, there's a lot of children have mistaken ideas about sexuality, and the ways that they adapt are not necessarily very healthy. They have trouble regulating their emotions. There's anxiety, there's depression, related to PTSD, like dissociation or hypervigilance or flashbacks, reliving what happened. So as you can see, there are all kinds of areas that may be impacted. Is this an exhaustive list? No, of course not. Each child has their own profile and their own story, their own background. So what's important is to take time to look at the child and look at the child as a whole person, and see what has been impacted by the sexual abuse that they suffered. Now, there are consequences for the child's loved ones. Disclosure by a child is like a bomb that explodes within a family, especially when the sexual abuse is committed with among siblings or in the family. So it's a real shock wave. People lose their bearings as the loved ones, the parents, they don't know. It feels surrealistic. This has to be a nightmare. This can't be happening under my roof. People don't understand. And the loved ones just they go into survival mode. So now I'm going to give you an example. Close your eyes, please, and imagine that a bomb has exploded in your house. Now, what do you see? What you'll see is debris, uh, dust, everything. And this is what you see in your safe place, what you've built over the years. Nothing exists. Everything's been blown away. And this is the shock that loved ones experience when the child discloses sexual abuse. And not only do the loved ones see the size of the disaster, and sometimes it takes time to see that, but it also triggers a whole socio-legal trajectory. There are investigators, child protection comes in and investigates, and they each have their own process and procedures. Decisions will have to be made to ensure the child's safety, but these decisions are not necessarily made by the loved ones. Who just have to watch things happening, and they can't do anything. All they can do is to see the debris piling up. So this is a situation uh, where the loved ones feel that they're in PTSD, they're having PTSD because they've lost their bearings. And sometimes the parents will be in greater difficulty than the children at the moment of disclosure. They too need support. They need a place that they can go to rest and to understand what's happening.
So why is it important to have prevention? Well, firstly, because Children and teenagers are particularly vulnerable when it comes to sexual abuse. The youngest children are dependent upon adults and they're used to listening to adults. You know, they're raised by being told, hey, you have to listen to the adults are right. And in several situations, life has shown the child that the adult is right. We can't question the adult's decisions. And young children, are especially sensitive when it comes to getting positive attention, which is a frequently used technique by perpetrators. And when we think about why we have to talk to our teenagers, well, let's talk about all the technologies that are taking more and more space in our lives, quite early, in fact, even before teenagehood. So we work in preventing cyber online sexual abuse. But you know, there's the development of identity, sexuality, which is combined with a research of strong sensations, of impulsivities, of a feeling of being invincible that a teenager owns. And that means that the teenager will find themselves in new risky situations. So prevention is essential, both in childhood and adolescence, when it comes to sexual abuse. And then let's add to that. The majority of children know the person who's assaulted them. It's someone from their loved ones, usually. So we still have to work on prevention by telling kids, well, be careful of strangers. Be aware. Don't get into somebody's car if you don't know them. Don't accept any candies from anyone you don't know. But we actually know that that's a very low proportion of people who are strangers to the child who will sexually abuse a child. It's usually someone who's close to the child. And Marie-Vincent, we've been observing the profiles of children who come to us, and over the past few years, we've noticed that between 98 and 99% of children knew their aggressor. We also have to work on prevention because it's hard to prove sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is a crime of the darkness. The child is often alone, and the adult, who should be someone the child can trust and able to help the child in that type of situation, could be one of the people who commits this sexual abuse. Generally, we have a tendency to look for, to detect a sign, to look for a sign, a visible sign in children. We want to be able to observe traces of the sexual abuse on the child's body, but these are mm, uh, erroneous ideas for several reasons. In fact, several types of sexual abuse don't leave any traces. When we think about the what we've presented at the start of this presentation, you know that some sexual abuse involves no physical contact, and several children will show no signs, letting us think that they've experienced sexual abuse. And other children, when they're young, aren't aware that they've experienced sexual abuse because they don't have any knowledge of such things. They're not aware of their sexuality. And it's quite rare that sexual abuse perpetrated against children is violent. So trying to look for traces is really not the thing to do. And finally, physical proofs. You know, when we talk about a forensic kit, it's quite rare when it comes to children to be able to find anything because children would have to speak almost immediately. We're talking about in the first 5 days following a sexual assault for for it to be possible to collect some medical legal evidence. So often we don't have concrete evidence, we don't have witnesses, um, we don't have any confessions from the perpetrator. So basically, everything rests on the word of the child or the teenager to be able to show evidence and move to court. So the problem with that often is that the word of children and teenagers is often questioned when it comes to sexual violence. When a child talks about sexual abuse or discloses sexual abuse, we have a tendency to question him, to really not believe him, because we don't want it to have happened. We're not sure that he really knows or she really knows what happened. We want to have evidence before we speak up. Because let's say that we make a mistake and that we say something that could eventually turn out to be untrue, or we might put into doubt what the child has said because of what we know about the child or some of the biases we might have towards that child. So, today, what I'm inviting you to do is when a child comes to talk to you about a sexual assault abuse, is to really ask yourself, what if it was true, instead of asking yourself, what if it's not true? Okay, let's talk now about best practices in preventing sexual abuse. So, I want to start by talking to you about the way we develop our programs at Marie-Vincent, our prevention programs. Our that development of prevention programs is quite recent. So I'll give you an overview of the various programs we have over the next few slides, but please know that we've been building all of our programs in the same way. So we always start by analyzing the needs in the field, and we do a literature review. So basically, we're looking at what the best practices are when it comes to prevention that were already assessed, that were already shown to be efficient. And then we'll also talk to our target audience. We'll work on the field, in the field, so that we're aware of their needs, so that they can do prevention with their kids. So we want to make sure that the programs we develop don't find themselves just getting getting dust on the shelf. We want to make sure that our programs are efficient and that they're used on an ongoing basis. So once we finish that analysis, then we develop an action plan. And then we're able to get some objectives, and then we decide what we'll look at for training, for toolbox, for resources. And every prevention program we develop will either involve a training or various tools or maybe both, so that we're able to answer to the needs that we found in the field. And then we move to pilot implementation. So this means that certain organizations that we collaborate with agree to test our trainings and our tools and comment afterwards and let us know how we can improve these so that we're then able to implement at wider scale for the greater public. And this will be accompanied by an assessment made by the Marie-Vincent Inter-University Research Chair. And this allows us to see if we're meeting our objectives when it comes to improvement, capacity, helping professionals intervene in case of disclosure, or if they see worrisome sexual behaviors. Are we improving knowledge? And are we improving attitudes, and understandings when it comes to sexual abuse and also when it comes to promoting healthy relationships? And our two pillars in these programs are always sexuality education and the promotion of healthy and equal relationships. This goes through all of our projects. It's essential so that we can develop an effective prevention program, short and long term, for children and adolescents. So we're looking at holistic sexuality education, where children can learn about content that's adapted to their age and to their level of psychosocial development, sexual development. It has to be healthy, inclusive, and positive. So when we're looking at a holistic approach, we're really saying that we want to touch on not just the sexual abuse, but we really want to have a biopsychosocial perspective on sexuality. So different components, different areas that integrate into the child's holistic growth, and that's integrated within our programs. We also want to include the aspect of healthy and equal relationships because it's been shown that violence is gender-based. So these prevention efforts must look at deconstructing myths and stereotypes when it comes to gender. They need to target learning healthy relationships and what these look like. We want to develop values, qualities, understandings, skill sets, everything. So when we promote healthy and equal relationships, We're trying to contribute to reducing risks of sexual abuse that are experienced and perpetrated, but we also want to target IPV, harassment, and everything else that accompanies it. So we use the ecosystemic approach to be able to develop our projects. So we really try and make sure that the child is at the core of what we're doing. So we know that this approach is recognized universally when it comes to prevention, but also when it comes to sexual abuse, we see how efficient it is. It's recommended that prevention programs for childhood sexual abuse be made in using a holistic approach, and that trusted adults which gravitate around this child can be directly touched or reached by these programs. Because we can't we can't make it so that the child is uniquely responsible for his or her own safety. You know, it's impossible that a child would have all of the tools they need to be able to protect themselves. The responsibility also falls on the shoulders of people close to the child, including the family, the community, and the society. So, education, training for professionals working with children, uh, actions for parents, for loved ones. And we're also targeting getting judicial and political support. We have awareness campaigns for the public so that we can deconstruct several taboos that are related to sexual assault. So that's the approach that we're adopting within our projects. And if we actually look a little deeper in in these systems, well, when it comes to the child, we can see that we're trying to improve the child's personal safety, and we're trying to give the child the tools to talk to their parents, especially when we get to a young child or a teenager. We want to make sure that the child is able to detect certain situations and really intervene in potential situations, for example, by disclosing. So we want to teach protective capabilities for the children. We want to help them recognize risky situations as well as tactics used by perpetrators. These tactics are something we don't really see in existing programs. It's as if people are hesitant to talk about these with children, but it's super important to do so. And now I'm talking about sexual abuse at globally, but I'm thinking of all the techniques used, detailed techniques used by online predators and by predators. Children need to be aware of these. They need to be aware. They need to be able to spot these, and they need to be able to disclose these. So we're really trying to help the child disclose and be able to recognize who the trusted adults around him are or her by telling the child that they have a right to protect themselves, informing the child of their rights. And it's essential in every situation to make sure that we're removing responsibility from the child. It's important to indicate that it's always the perpetrator that's responsible for their actions. It's never the child. And then working with families and loved ones. It's really important to raise awareness, to let them become aware of their role when it comes to preventing sexual abuse in children. We've noticed that several loved ones, several parents are quite aware of the fact that they're the first educators when it comes to sexuality education for their children, but they'll often push that discussion further. They're waiting until the child becomes a teenager. They're afraid. There's a lot of myths that we'll be covering, a lot of obstacles that hinder education, sexuality education. So it's important to inform loved ones about the problem of sexual abuse in children. It's important to talk to them about their role of being a positive influence for their child. Because once parents participate in prevention programs, they're able to become stronger parents and develop stronger communication skills in order to communicate with their children about sexual abuse. They're able to acquire knowledge, they're able to deconstruct certain false constructs, and they're able to confront certain fears when it comes to sexual abuse. So this really opens up the dialogue on sexuality between parents and children, and this will have a positive impact on children. They'll feel welcome, heard, understood, and this will have an impact on their sexual behavior because they'll have the opportunity to really put into practice their protective skill sets that they've learned within the prevention programs. So they're more able to take responsibility for their own safety. They'll also be more comfortable asking questions. So about so sexual behaviors when it comes to when they become teenagers will be better informed because they'll have found proper answers to their questions. So we can see that for children and for parents, there are advantages when parents and loved ones involve themselves in sexuality education and programs promoting healthy and equal relationships. Let's talk about the community and training for professionals working with children. We need to work at developing knowledge and developing attitudes. Because sometimes we might have knowledge, but if our perception of sexuality education or of healthy and equal relationships, sometimes our values, there can be hiccups there. So it's important to target the whole thing. We need to raise awareness with professionals on the importance of their role because we know that professionals working with children really represent a high proportion of people reporting possible sexual abuse in children. But even then, when we meet with professionals, they tell us that they're not really aware of all of the problems related to childhood and adolescence sexual abuse. And they don't have all the necessary knowledge to know when they're supposed to report a situation that worries them and what happens after that report, what protection mechanisms are there for the child. We need to guide them better in that process. So we need to raise awareness of their role. We need to reinforce their capacity to intervene, and this will better support children because a professional that's more able to detect situations that are risky or that has been trained on how to accept a disclosure will be calmer, will be more ready, and that could have a positive impact on the child's trajectory. And lastly, we want to raise awareness with the public and we want to promote social change. So this goes through encouraging social norms that foster zero tolerance for sexual abuse. It goes through promoting gender equality in relationships. It goes through creating safe living environments. And also, we want to focus on the work we can do with our youth in developing social skills to have healthy and equal positive relationships. At Marie-Vincent, we have people who are super committed who will present on various platforms to talk about the problem, to raise awareness with the public when it comes to the importance of having services for our youth, having prevention services for our youth, and for being part of the protecting community. Still today, there are still myths and false beliefs that impede us from doing proper work when it comes to sexuality education. And one of the myths is that it will break their innocence. It will give them ideas. If we start too soon, young kids will start having a bunch of sexual behaviors. That really worries a lot of adults talking about sexuality education. That was one of the obstacles we faced when we developed our Lantern projects for children from 0 to 5. So this is what we generally answer, is that what we want to break is not their innocence, it's their ignorance. What we want is to give them tools to be able to detect situations that could be violent or that could be sexually abusive. We want to give them the ability to be better heard by the adults around them, to know that their words will be taken into consideration. So, what we've been seeing is that kids who will have access to early sexuality education that's healthy, that's positive, that's holistic, that looks at every area of a child's development and is adapted to their psychosocial sexual development. means that there will be a reduction in problematic sexual behaviors because this really addresses their curiosity. They see that the subject's not taboo. They're allowed to ask questions in the same way that they're allowed to ask questions on other parts of the body or on life in general. And even in teenagers, some studies show that kids who've received sexuality education when they were young will delay their first sexual relationship because they have access to all of the tools to make proper decisions when the time comes. Another concern that's often present is the lack of knowledge about psychosexual development and the misconception that adult sexuality is the same as childhood sexuality. So often we perceive the child as living in an adult world, and when the child adopts sexual behaviors, we look at it through our adult eyes and we analyze it through our own motivations as adults. For example, fantasies, eroticism, seduction. But for a child, it's not that at all. That's not what motivates his sexual behaviors. The child is curious, the child wants to explore, the child is looking for sensory pleasure. So we really have to get out of our adult brain looking at the child's behaviors. Be- and we have to know the psychosexual development in adults. So everyone's personal beliefs and experiences can have an impact on how we perceive sexuality education. Did we have access to it officially as kids, or was it informal? Did we experience traumatic sexuality that might have an impact on how we perceive a child's sexuality? So that could have an impact and could influence our perception. And in adults, also there's a contradiction between the desire to protect and the act of educating. We can't really bridge the two sometimes. We don't want children to be exposed to the internet, to sources of information that aren't reliable, to give them false informations. But at the same time, we hesitate to give them information ourselves because we don't know how far we can go. And we don't think that we're able to protect them. But in fact, it's the opposite. It does protect them. And there are several advantages in providing our kids with sexuality education. They become aware of their rights. They are able to develop healthy relationships. Could be as children, but also later as sexual relationships. For example, we see in youth that have had access to holistic and positive sexuality education that they seek consent in greater numbers. They are more aware of what constitutes a healthy relationship with someone else. And when it comes to sexuality, in our teens, we see that there's reduced risky sexual behaviors, there's an increased use of contraception. So these are very positive situations, advantages for our kids. And we can also add that there's an enhanced sense of self-efficacy because kids are able to identify risky situations. They have an idea what they're supposed to do. So this helps a child's perception of the event. So, as I mentioned, we have several prevention programs that are developed at Marie-Vincent. So we'll be looking at them quite quickly because I see that time is flying by. So these are prevention programs. So for ages 0 to 5, we have three programs. There's the Lantern program, which is for children from 0 to 5. And for the children that work or live with the child. So this program is being used in home-based childcare providers, in community organizations, and it's also being used to train some business-based childcare providers. So there are several tools available through this. You'll be able to find them on our website, Marie-Vincent. You can download them and they're free. And this is prevention programs for children 0 to 12. The first one, Lantern, is for 0 to 5. Then we have the Compass program, which is for children 6 to 12 years old. This targets adults that work in community organizations as well as leisure camp. For example, if a child goes to a summer camp, the workers come. They follow a prevention program on healthy relationships, and we also have the Pathways Project, which targets children between 4 and 12 years old, and this is for children that require additional support. So These three programs work to reinforce capacities for professionals. So we're talking to professionals who work with children who will then know how to use our toolkits and implement them while they work with children.
Now, in terms of our adolescents, we have programs to prevent cyber violence, cyber abuse. So there's a program for peers, and then there's the web game sensitive areas, which is available on our website. And it deals with first sexual experiences, exploitation, consentment, and it's a peer approach. Adolescents from grades 9 to 11 make their peers aware of sexual abuse online. And then and there are there's another approach, heads or tails, to raise awareness, and then there's an intervention kit. There we distributed 300 kits in the to talk about sexual exploitation. And there's a new project that's coming up soon. It's to prevent sexual abuse and online sexual abuse amongst young athletes. This project is called the Halftime Project. Now, I'd also like to talk to you about the foundations of the specialized sexual abuse intervention program. So a child has been victimized, has disclosed and is referred to us. So I'm going to show you the kind of program and the trajectory of services when they come into our program. So we work with children from 0 to 17. For the under 14 who have been victims of sexual abuse, the sexual abuse has to have been reported by Child Protective Services or the police. But this is not the case for teenagers who are 14 or over. They have to report, but it doesn't have to be confirmed by others. So this clinical pathway was revised in 2023 in order to improve service flow and reduce wait times. We went from previously a 24-month wait time. Now it's a little less than 16 months to get access to our services, and that's still too long, but that's great. That is still very successful. And our goal is to have a 6-month wait time period between the service request and the evaluation. And as I said earlier on, sexual abuse is a bomb that goes off in the family. So we offer support services to the loved ones, to the family at the time of disclosure, because we're very aware that the family, their collateral damage. It's a bit like being in a plane. We tell people to put their seatbelts on before they go to help their children. We want to ensure that there's a space for people to be cared for. We want to be able to answer the family's questions and receive support so that the children are taken better care of, because we know that it's the loved ones, it's the family who help to take care of the children. Then there is also immediate interventions, working with the loved ones, and soon we will have an intervention system for loved ones whose children have problematic sexual behaviors. So now, what we really want to do is give support and give information on medical services, social services, legal services. We want to look at emotions related to sexual abuse. We want to help the loved ones understand what their role is and how to take care of themselves. And then what we do is we do a needs assessment of the child. The first thing we do is document the child or the adolescent's condition in various areas of their life. We look at the problems and the impacts of having undergone sexual abuse so that we can really identify their needs in terms of support and referrals. We do clinical interviews with the children and the loved ones. We do standardized questionnaires. We have a research student who does these questionnaires. There's also consultation and documentation. We look at the reports from the police and from child protection and medical reports. There are interviews with various professionals, if necessary, the professionals who are also already working with these children, to see how we should prioritize our actions and how we should offer services and what kinds of services we need to offer. So first, there's the psychosocial intervention, which is based on a cognitive behavioral approach to meet the needs of the child or teen who was identified, needs that were identified during the evaluation. And what we do is develop um, how they can manage their emotions and how they can adapt and understand the link between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And then we identify whether there are any harmful or erroneous thoughts related to sexual assault or sexual violence and sexuality. Um, we do sexuality education. We um, do a lot of sexuality education working on the on assertiveness and self-protection skills and self-esteem skills. And through this psychosocial intervention, we always encourage the non-perpetrator loved one, the one who gives support, to learn about all of this too. Now, in terms of individual psychotherapy, we have the same objectives as those that I mentioned in the psychosocial approach. But in addition, we work on revealing the memories of the trauma. In terms of individual psychotherapy, we have our psychotherapists who are there. They're either psychologists or sexologists who support the child. And we work on releasing their PTSD or lowering their feelings of PTSD, alleviating them. And as far as those who have problematic sexual behaviors, the first thing we do is identify them and the needs addressed by these problematic behaviors, and then identify the triggering and maintaining factors. We also do group psychotherapy at Marie-Vincent. It depends on the clientele, of course. We have two clinicians working together, a psychotherapist and a psychosocial worker who offer this group psychotherapy. It all depends, of course, on our clients and the needs that we identified for each one of these clients. And that leads us to decide whether or not we're going to open a group. Now, once a child has been seen by us, we can always they can always come back for services afterwards. It's very important for us to leave the door open to the child. And the end of the follow-up is important. It's we You can see in our logo, there's a little bear called Marvin. And when the child finishes the intervention, they go home with Marvin. The child can even choose clothing to dress the little bear. They're knitted by volunteers. At the Sometimes we send up balloons to recognize uh, the experience of the child, what they've gone through. It's important to celebrate everything that the child and their loved ones have done during the intervention. Here are different various quotes from children that I think are very evocative. These are children who participated in the evaluation of therapeutic services offered by Marie-Vincent. These quotes come out of our satisfaction reports over the last few years, because I am much happier than before. And thanks to this therapy, I was able to focus on myself and get rid of the feeling of guilt. I also feel less isolated and spend more time with my family. So there's a child who feels much less responsible for what happened. And a child said, I learned that it wasn't my fault, that there are many ways to feel better and that there will always be somebody there to help me. An adolescent said, with strategies to feel better and also advice to recognize my emotions and understand them and figure out what's going wrong. And so here you can see that we were working on recognizing and managing emotions. And another teen said, therapy helped me to take a step back from situations, try to see them differently, and also think before I speak. So this helps them with their perception of various situations, including situations of course, of sexual abuse. Now, to end today's presentation, the last chapter is going to deal with the child's reclaiming their own power. How can we ensure that that sexual abuse does not define the child and that it is just seen as a difficult moment in their life? So we work on the child being able to reclaim their own power. Now, when there's disclosure of sexual abuse, a whole socio-legal trajectory starts. You can see it here on the screen. It may look very simple on screen, but in reality, it's very complicated. It's not linear. We do not know how long it's going to last. And all through this trajectory, the child and their loved ones will meet with many professionals with different roles, and each department, each services has its own timelines, its own procedures. And you can see here, you can see the little bubbles in the corner. Those are all points in time when the child might have to tell once again their story, to repeat their story. And when you have to repeat yourself constantly, it means there's a possibility of secondary victimization. Secondary victimization is not reliving a new crime. We're not talking about re-victimizing the child. We're not talking about multiple victimization. What we're talking about is when a child is a victim, there are those around them react sometimes negatively, both in the family and in the social legal system. This can be felt, and they don't necessarily feel that they're being helped. And this exacerbates their distress, the trauma that they're experiencing. And we know that the more often the child has to repeat his story or her story, the more often they might have to deal with this victimization and feel secondary victimization. And that's why in how we work on prevention, we have to prevent this secondary victimization. To do so, we have developed certain tools and training sessions to help people to understand the trajectory, both for the loved ones, the child, and the professionals. So, and that will help loved ones to further support the child. And also, it also helps the various players to be able to work together. Overall, there are very simple ways to encourage the child being able to take back his or her power. First of all, you have to make sure that the child understands their role and our role as professionals. You have to say to the child why they're there. Give them strategic information. For instance, just explaining to the child that we when there's an interview with the investigator, the child's role is to help the investigator understand what happened. The child has to be aware of what's expected of him or her, to have access to information. We don't hide any strategic information from the child. When you arrive in the courtroom and evidence is given, like it has to, and for instance, they read the child's diary, the child has to know ahead of time, and they need support services as the child witness program that has been developed in Quebec, and it helps children to effectively testify and effectively answer the court's questions. There are also different types of support that we can give to children that are based on the needs of the child. For instance, an emotional support dog, or allow the child to testify in a room that is far from where the perpetrator is. These are ways to prevent secondary victimization. And also, we also have to make sure that the culture of the system we're working in is understood. Often we're working with laws, procedures, the language is very specific. We use abbreviations when we talk amongst ourselves. We, as professionals, we see a lot of children, a lot of teens rather, but each child, each teen, each family, for them, you might be the only professional investigator, the only professional child protection representative that they will meet. This is an important experience, and this will have an impact on the child's trajectory. And that has to be thought of too. In Marie-Vincent, taking into consideration the child is a priority for us. The child knows that under all circumstances, we believe in them, we're there to support them, we give them choices and options, we respect their choices, and it's a priority for us. Throughout the social legal trajectory, there are lots of opportunities to do this. For instance, a recent example, there was a judge who took time to explain to a child after having found the perpetrator non-guilty, he explained to the child that he believed the child's testimony, but there reasonable doubt exists in the law, and because of the legislation, he was not be able to find the perpetrator guilty. But he nevertheless believed the child, and that makes a huge difference for the child. And you can it's important to get the child's feedback, to find out how they felt about our work with them and how we can improve our services. This is another way of helping the child reclaim their power.
And lastly, we have to make sure that we can minimize the difficulties for the child. I think that in today's world, we talk about different justices. There's distributive and retributive justice. This means that if a person is found guilty or not guilty, this is not as important as what is considered to be procedural justice, where someone believes the child. Well, the child felt he was believed or she was believed, that someone heard their voice, that the child was able to express their opinion, and the child was accompanied throughout all of those steps within the process. That really is what makes a difference for the child and allows the child to experience reparative justice. So thank you. Thank you for letting me go over my time a little bit. I hope we have time to answer some questions, but this is the end of my presentation for today.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your important and very, very informative presentation. Questions have been coming in from participants, so we can move right into Q&A. And my colleague Sabri will be joining me to share questions with you. Okay, so we received a question from a participant sharing that they have recently been hearing from other experts in this field and youth workers that there are many issues with disclosure to police, where victims are not being believed and the perpetrator does not see consequences. And the act of reporting is often more harmful for the victim emotionally and psychologically. They share that this is very troubling and ask if there are any ways to overcome this. They recognize it's a complex question.
Oui, tout à fait. Merci beaucoup, Jenna, pour cette question et merci à la
Yes, Jenna,
participante
thank you
aussi
for this
qui l'a
question, and thank
posée.
you to the participant who
C'est
asked the
vrai que
question.
parfois, on peut
It's
voir
true
que
that
quand la
sometimes
parole de l'enfant est
we can
hypocrite,
see
il peut
that
avoir
when
des
the child
impacts
isn't
sur
believed,
l'enfant.
there
Et
are
d'ailleurs,
impacts for
pourquoi
the child.
nous,
And
on
that's
travaille
why
beaucoup à
we
sensibiliser les
work
professionnels
to raise
justement à
awareness in
l'importance de leur
professionals
langue
to the
et de
importance of
croire les enfants
listening and
quand ils font
believing
des
children
témoignages parce
when
qu'on
they
sait à quel
disclose,
point
because we
les
know
taux de
that
fausses allégations sont
rates
très
of false
élevés
allegations are
dans
quite
le cas de
low
violence sexuelle auprès
in
des enfants.
childhood
Et
sexual
donc,
abuse
l'importance de croire,
situations.
l'importance de
So
bien
it's important
accueillir
to
et
believe, to
d'aller
welcome the disclosure,
réagir de
and
façon
to react in
diligente
a
quand une
way that's
situation de violence sexuelle qui est
diligent
déclarée.
when
Donc, nous, on
there's
travaille beaucoup
such
avec
a
les autorités
reporting.
pour
So we
parler de
work with
ça.
authorities quite a bit
Par contre, moi,
to go through
je
all of
comprends
this.
l'impuissance que les
I do
professionnels peuvent
understand how
vivre quand
professionals can
ils
feel
vont signaler une
powerless
situation
when they
et
want
ça n'est
to
pas
report a
retenu.
situation and the
On
report's
s'inquiète
not
pour
retained.
l'enfant, on s'inquiète
We
pour le
worry about the
parent,
child, we
on
worry about the
aimerait qu'il y ait du
family,
support
we
qui se
want there
déploie.
to be
Mais moi, ce que
supports.
je dis toujours aux
But
professionnels, c'est de se
what I tell
souvenir
the
que
professionals is
même
that
si
they
cette
need to keep in
fois-ci,
mind that
ça n'a
even
pas
if
eu le
this
résultat
time it didn't have
escompté,
the result
c'est
that was
un
hoped for the
petit
family,
détail de
that's just
l'histoire de
one
cet
small
enfant-là
piece
qu'on n'est
in
pas
the
encore à
child's
puis peut-être que
story,
quelqu'un
a
d'autre
little piece
va
of the
apporter un
puzzle
nouveau
in his life.
réflexe
And maybe somebody else
et
will
l'autre
contribute another
personne
piece,
va
and then
apporter un
another
nouveau
person,
réflexe.
another
Puis
piece.
à un moment
And
donné,
then
on
at
va être
one
en mesure
point,
de bien
we'll be able
reconstituer le casse-tête
to
puis de comprendre
to
qu'est-ce qui se
put
passe pour
together
cet
this puzzle
enfant-là,
and really
comment
understand
on
what's
peut le
going on for this
protéger.
child and how we
Alors,
can
de
protect
garder
that
en
child.
tête qu'il
So
n'y a
keeping
pas de
in mind
mauvais signalement
that there's
nécessairement
no
qu'on va donner. Tout
report
simplement vise
that's
à protéger
shouldn't be
l'enfant
done. Every
puis
report aims to
de
protect a child,
continuer à
and we
jouer
need
notre
to
rôle
keep
auprès de ces
going and
enfants-là puis
keep
de
playing our
s'assurer
role with that
du
child and
mieux
with the
qu'on peut,
family as best
puis
as we
s'assurer que le
can.
filet de sécurité
And we
est
need to make
déployé
sure
aussi
that we
pour que
create
ce
a
rôle-là
safety net for
soit
the
comme
child.
aussi
It's
efficace
not,
que
it doesn't come, sorry, it's not our responsibility only to create that safety net
Merci
for the
pour ta
child.
réponse, Jessica. On a eu pas
Thank
mal
you,
reçu
Jessica,
plusieurs
for your answer.
questions et
We've
beaucoup d'engagement là, de la part
gotten
des personnes
several
participantes.
questions
On a eu
from
une
the
autre question d'un
participants.
participant qui est
So
curieux
a participant wants to
par rapport au
know
comportement des préadolescents
when it
qui
comes
dessinent des
to
organes génitaux, par exemple.
preteens'
Est-ce que ce
behaviors,
comportement
they're
serait le
drawing
résultat
pictures
d'un
of
abus
genitals, for
justement
example.
qu'ils
Would
ont
that be the
pu
result of a
faire
sexual abuse that they
l'expérience?
might have
Certaines familles,
experienced?
elles peuvent être surprises ou
Some
inquiètes, ou elles
families
se
might be
demandent aussi s'il
worried,
s'agit d'un
might be
abus
surprised,
sexuel.
and they
Et en fait,
wonder,
les
does that
participants
mean that the
voudraient
child
bien
has been
avoir,
sexually
savoir qu'est-ce que
abused?
tu en
And
penses.
they'd like to know what
C'est
you
une très bonne
think.
question. En
Yeah,
fait,
great
de
question,
dessiner des
says
organes
Jessica.
génitaux,
Well,
dessiner
drawing
des corps en
genitals,
général, c'est
drawing
pas quelque
bodies
chose
in
qui va
general, that's not
ressortir
necessarily
du développement
something
du
that
cerveau
will
sexuel comme étant
come
quelque chose
out
d'inquiétant.
as
Ça fait partie
being
de la découverte, de
worrisome.
la
This is part of the
curiosité avec
child's
les corps en
discovery,
général.
of the child's
Et ça fait tout dépend
curiosity
aussi de
with
l'âge de
regards to
l'enfant.
bodies in general. And of
Mais moi,
course,
ce
that
qui
depends
inquiète
on
le
the age of
plus
the child. But
quand il est question
what
de
worries
dessin,
me
ça va être vraiment quand
when
il y a
it
des
comes
actes
to pictures
sexuels qui
is
sont
when there
dessinés.
are
Donc, quand on va
sexual
voir des personnages
acts
qui sont en
that are
action,
depicted.
par
So we
exemple,
see
quand il va y
people
avoir des
in
séquences
the
au niveau du
situation.
nombre
So
de
if there's a
fois où on voit que la
frequency in the
femme va
number of
travailler, que ça
times
va
that
être
the
très
drawing comes up, we can see
étrangeant,
that it's something that
ça veut pas
preoccupies the
dire
child, that is
nécessairement qu'il y a
invading
une
his
violence
thoughts or her
sexuelle. C'est
thoughts.
pas
It doesn't mean that
associé
sexual abuse
directement
has
ça,
happened.
mais ça
There
peut
can't be
vouloir
that
dire
direct
qu'on devrait
association,
peut-être
but
aller
this might
prendre le
mean
temps de
that
questionner cet
we should
enfant-là de
take the
manière
time to
non-suggestive,
talk to the
faire des
child and
questions
ask
simples, par
questions
exemple,
in a
pour aller voir
non-suggestive
est-ce qu'il
manner.
est
Ask
assez
him
présent
or her to
donc pour
explain
s'inquiéter d'une
their
situation
drawing
potentielle chez cet
and try and
enfant-là.
figure out if
Mais
there are
de façon
signs.
générale,
But generally
dessiner
speaking,
des personnes
drawing
nues, ça peut être
naked
lié à de la
people, this could
curiosité,
be
ça peut être
related to
lié à l'enfant
curiosity, to
justement
the fact that the
se
child,
questionne, veut
is
comprendre.
asking
Donc c'est pas
themselves
quelque chose qui va
questions. So that doesn't worry me.
Alors, merci.
Thank you for your question. I have a second one before moving to Jenna. Based on your experience and on studies made with children experiencing sexual abuse, the majority of cases involves people the child knew or people the child's family knew. What do you think of that?
Mais en fait,
Yes,
effectivement, la
says
plupart du
Jessica.
temps, c'est
Well,
quelqu'un dans
in
l'entourage
fact,
immédiat de
it's
l'enfant
usually
qui
someone in the
agit.
child's
C'est assez
immediate
simple de l'expliquer en fait.
proximity who's
C'est une
the
question
aggressor.
d'accès.
And
Alors,
it's hard to
quand
explain,
c'est
but
un
really it
proche,
comes
les
down
accès sont
to
faciles.
access. You know, when the children are young, access is
Les gens
easy.
autour font confiance.
And
Donc, c'est
generally,
facile de
people
pouvoir prendre
around
l'enfant
the
à
child
part, de
trust
passer
that
du temps
person. So
avec
it's
cet
easy to spend
enfant-là
time alone with that
et
child,
de
to
mettre
take the
en
child
place
away from
de
other
façon
people. So
moins
this
évidente pour pouvoir
gets set into motion in ways that are a
quelque chose
little
qui
more
arrive.
hidden and not
Alors
quite
que quand c'est quelqu'un
obvious.
qui n'est
It's
pas
easier to do it
directement
that
lié
way
à
as
l'enfant, qui est
opposed to
plus
someone who has no
familial,
direct
par
relationship
exemple,
with the
va
child,
demander un
someone
petit peu
who's
plus
outside the
de
family. This would
travail
require a little bit
psychologique
more
pour avoir
work
accès à
to
l'enfant.
be able to have access to the child. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. In your presentation, you spoke about protection skills. Could you please provide some examples of protection skills?
Oui, tout à fait. Je peux
Yes,
vous parler, par
absolutely,
exemple,
says
chez les
Jessica.
tout petits, ce qu'on va
So
aller
when it comes to
travailler,
the very
c'est
little ones,
l'affirmation de soi.
we
Donc,
try and talk
d'être
about
capable de dire non,
self-affirmation,
de
being
dire
able to
quand
say no, being able to
la
say
personne
when,
va franchir notre
you
bulle,
know,
franchir une
the
limite.
person is
Alors,
inside our
je vais
bubble,
essayer,
has
par exemple,
crossed
de
our
l'encourager à
boundaries. We're
dire
trying
non
to encourage the young children to say no when it comes to physical contact if they don't feel like having them, even with people who love them. That's a really important concept that we have to work with the child because little children aren't necessarily comfortable saying to someone they know, saying no. So helping them know that when we don't really feel good, like when something makes me feel bad in my heart, in my body, in my mind, or that I'm questioning myself, I'm asking myself, what can I do? Well, these are things that you can do. You can go see a trusted adult around you, and we help them recognize who that person is, to look at what the protection measures are. I can say no, I can scream, I can run away, I can go see an adult. And then when we get to a child that's between 6 and 12 years, we'll talk about good secrets and bad secrets, a good touch and a bad touch, risky situations. We'll talk about consent in a more formal way. So there are several capacities when it comes to, or competencies when it comes to protection. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Jenna?
Sure, Sabri, last one.
Sure. Alors, on va aller avec
All right.
une question par rapport
A question
réaction émotionnelle des parents
when
et
it
de la
comes to
famille.
the parents and
Certaines
loved ones'
personnes se
emotional
demandaient est-ce que
reaction.
la
Someone
réaction
was wondering,
émotionnelle des
is
parents
the
et de la
emotional
famille elle
reaction
influence
from the parent
l'effet
or loved
traumatique
one
sur les
having an
enfants, en
influence on the traumatic
particulier les
effect
très jeunes enfants qui peuvent ne pas
experienced by the
comprendre
child,
ou
especially
réaliser
young children
pleinement ce qu'ils ont
who
vécu.
might not be able to
Car
completely
parfois,
understand what they've
les jeunes enfants vont
experienced?
retourner
And
directement vers leurs
sometimes young
parents qui peut-être ne vont
children will
pas
turn to
comprendre
their
leur
parents and not really
est-ce que tu
understand
aurais
their
des choses à nous
reaction.
dire par rapport à
What
ça?
could you tell us about that?
Oui, effectivement, ça peut avoir un impact sur
Yes,
les réactions des
says
enfants,
Jessica.
sur la
That
façon
can
dont
have an
ils
impact on the
répondent.
child's
Certains
reactions
parents
and
vont faire un
on the
petit peu
child's
comme s'ils
trajectory. Sometimes the
oublient de
parents are
dire
so
à
stressed
l'enfant,
out
par
that they
exemple,
forget to tell the child
c'est pas de la faute de
that
l'enfant
it's
s'il
not
se
the
sent comme
child's
ça, parce
fault
qu'on sait que les enfants
and
vont
things like
de
that, because we
nature
know that
être égocentriques, puis
naturally children
penser
are
que ce qui se
self-centered
passe,
and,
c'est leur
you know,
faute.
they're
Hein?
thinking that
Puis
everything
donc, dans
that's
ce
going on
genre de
is their fault. So in
situation-là,
this kind of
automatiquement,
situation,
si je vois mon parent qui est en détresse,
automatically,
qui
you know,
pleure, qui
if
va
my
revenir,
parent is
je vais penser
crying,
que
is
c'est à
stressed
cause de
out,
moi, que c'est
I'll
moi
think
qui ai
it's my
causé cette
fault that
détresse-là.
I've
C'est
caused
pour ça qu'on
that
travaille
distress.
très fort à
So
éviter
that's
les
why we
phrases
really work to
d'adolescents
try
comme
and give
oui,
the
je suis
loved
claire,
ones
oui, ça me
tools
fait de la
to
peine.
tell the child,
Oui,
yes, I'm
je pleure
crying,
pas
yes,
à
I'm
cause
hurt,
de toi,
but I'm not
je pleure
crying
à cause de ce
because
que
of
tu as
you.
vécu parce
I'm
que je veux
crying
pas
because of what
que
you've
ça arrive ce
experienced,
genre de
because I
choses-là.
didn't want this
C'est
type
pas
of
de
thing
toi
to
qui a
happen
fait
to
de
you,
la peine.
but you're not the one
Alors,
who
il y a
hurt my
beaucoup de
feelings.
travail à
So
venir
there's a lot of work
équiper
there
les parents
to
de parler
provide
de
the
leurs
parents with the right
émotions avec leurs
tools to
enfants.
speak of their emotions with their child.
Merci beaucoup, Jessica, pour toutes tes
Thank
réponses.
you, Jessica, for all your answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica, for your presentation today and for your time. I also want to say thank you to all of the interpreters who joined us today. Thank you to Sylvie, Wendy, Christy, Alex, Simon, and Jerry.
Merci beaucoup, Jenna.
Thank you, Jenna, says Jessica.